Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out. We did have fun last night, so I think we could have all used that 15 minutes, so thanks a lot for that. Well, I'm delighted to be here on the last day. I am from the States. I'm from North Carolina, so that if you hear a twang, I'm trying to control it, but I'm not as good at it as I'd like to be sometimes, so especially when I get animated. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some work that I was a part of that I think really makes a difference in how we think about places and how we vision places. My daughter is 6 years old, and when we were flying across the country one time, when she was probably 4 or 5, she was looking down at the scenery. You know, we were going over the Rockies and the Mississippi River and all of that, and she said, "Mommy, how do the mountains and the rivers, how do those come to be? How did they get there?" And I was like, great, a question I know the answer to, because sometimes she asks questions, and I'm like, well, let Mommy look it up. But this one I knew. And so I'm explaining to her, you know, how it happens over time and what it's all about. And she's looking at me, and she's looking at me, and finally she just says, "Mommy, if you don't know the answer, just say so, because what you're saying could not possibly be the way it happens." And I said, well, yeah, it is, but you tell me, how do you think it happens over time? And she says, well, I think the people who live in those places decided they wanted mountains, and they decided they wanted rivers in their place. So they get a bucket of dirt and rock, and they dump their bucket out, and other people in the community come and dump their bucket out, and then mommies do it, and dads do it, and children do it, and grandparents do it. And over time, with everybody's bucket, they get their mountain. And with everybody's bucket of water, they get their river. And I thought, she's a little placemaker. Isn't that awesome? Because it's a really good way to think about the thing that we do. We build places over time in a collaborative effort. And I spend a lot of time talking about the motivation behind bringing your bucket every day to the place. Where does that motivation come from at a resident level, at a leadership level? What motivates us to come every single day and bring our bucket? And so, you know, I think it's critical as a field that as we talk a lot about the what that we do, we also have to be very deliberate about the why that we're doing it and understanding the motivation, what's behind those efforts. Because if we can't get people outside of our realm to understand the why, they're much less interested in the what. And so sometimes in all of our conversations, I always find myself, because of my background, taking a step back and trying to reorganize the ideas, starting with the why of placemaking. And luckily, I was part of a research project that really went to answer those questions specifically. So I was part of this research team that it was funded by Knight Foundation, which is a national foundation in the States in Miami, Florida. And the polling was done by the Gallup organization, which many people know, of course. And my job was sort of as the center to help with, because I used to work for the foundation. I didn't work for it at the time of Soul of the Community, but I used to work for the foundation, so I understood what funders care about. I understood about the places that Knight cared about. And because I have an academic background, I understood what the hell Gallup was talking about most of the time. And I also, because I had a community practitioner background, I understood how places kind of work. So I was in the middle of this great collaboration. And when we started this, we had no interest in justifying a field of placemaking. I mean, this was in 2007, 2008. I'll confess, I didn't even know the word placemaking. It wasn't something that we were trying to do with the work. And yet, why we were doing it was because Knight Foundation is a place-based foundation that funds 26 communities come hell or high water, and both have come to these places over time, and Knight has stuck with them. And Knight began to ask themselves, do places still matter to people? Have we become so porous in our boundaries, in geography, with technology, that the place that we actually live and work and enjoy, does it still have real meaning to us as people? anymore? Or has place kind of evaporated at the altar of technology and all these other things? So it was really an exploratory research project. It wasn't a project on public spaces. It wasn't a project to talk about placemaking. It was truly just trying to examine these two questions, which is, what makes people love where they live and why does it matter? Now, the technical questions were, what are the things that most drive resident attachment, and what are the ultimate outcomes of place of that attachment? But of course, when you're talking to folks, sometimes you have to break it down into something that is a little more easier to understand. So we use the word love in place of attachment often. And why does it matter was the so what that we were trying to understand. So if you look at the night communities, these are 26 communities in the States, obviously. They're very diverse in their economies, in their demographics, in where they are in the economic fallout that we were experiencing in the States at that time. And they range everything from Detroit to Wichita to Milledgeville. So we have really big cities, really small towns. Of course, there is some geographic clustering on the East Coast. And those of you who are curious, the night communities became the night communities because the foundation was founded by the Knight brothers, who were newspaper guys. And they founded the foundation to support the places that they owned newspapers when the last Knight brother died. So donor intent is donor intent. And a lot of times people say, how can we become a night community? Well, the donors decided that a long time ago. So these were the places that we have, incredibly diverse and interesting places. The sole model that we worked off of in really creating this idea of what is soul of the community and how does it work for attachment really started with trying to define attachment. What does attachment to place look like? How would you measure that? And one of the things that we figured out pretty quickly is you don't go and ask people what attaches you to place, because you get different answers, rather than treating attachment the way that it is, which is a multi-dimensional idea. It doesn't come from just that word attachment. It comes from a lot of different things that people feel about their place. So as you see here, we looked at outlook, which is how optimistic are people about their community's future. And what we found just on that alone is that the more optimistic people are about their community's future, the more attached they are to it today. Which in and of itself was a really interesting finding, because we're always in this work of inspiring optimism and then helping to deliver on that optimism. So understanding that these feelings of forward-thinkingness matter to how people feel about a place today was quite interesting. We also look at just general satisfaction. How satisfied are you living there? A lot of municipalities and cities that I work in think that if they ask people, are you satisfied living here, that constitutes attachment. And it doesn't. Because satisfaction does not predict that you won't pack your bags and leave tomorrow. Attachment seems to have an indication of the stick-to-itiveness that people have towards their place. So feeling like it's the perfect place for me, that a resident feels an identification with that place. Not that it's perfect, but they feel that they belong there. And it's a real visceral feeling that you feel, that they would recommend it to other people as a place to live, and that they have a sense of pride in that place. So that was really the attachment construct. And methodologists in the room would be interested to know that these hang in a factor quite well, that they really seem to be explaining a phenomenon within people. And if you understand that the unit of analysis is place, so it's not how satisfied am I in my life, it's how satisfied am I in living in this experience that I'm having here in this place. That would have been great for many of us just to understand that component. But I think as we were developing this research, we understood that if we were going to make this research actionable and applied, we needed to find a way to understand what are the things about a place that drive those feelings. We have to understand, is there a pattern to places that inspire these feelings? And if so, what are the characteristics about a place that do in fact inspire those feelings? So we started looking at these attachment drivers. And this was based on some research that Gallup had done in other settings that we sort of modified and improved for the Soul of the Community project. But one of the things I want to point out to you is that, if you can see there is two kinds of drivers of attachment. It's what the place offers the resident. So what does the place offer the resident in terms of services, leadership, education, safety, social offerings? Of course, some of that comes from the private sector as well, aesthetics, the local economy. That's what the place brings to the table. But there's also this thing that the resident brings to the table in creating a place. It's not just what our places do for us. It's also what we do for our places by our very presence in them. So there we talk about how does the resident contribute to feelings of welcomeness in the community? How do we deal with each other at a civil level? What are our social capital connections? What are our civic engagement patterns? All of that. So what we were hoping to understand is, are there certain things about a place that drive those feelings, and can we identify them? And then, of course, because we knew that if we wanted this research to reach another level, we needed to have a so what. Because I think in a lot of our work, sometimes if you don't have a so what that matters to other sectors, it stays within just one sector. And so what we wanted to do is say, well, can we make an empirical connection between these feelings and a hard outcome in the way places are usually measured? And for our communities in 2008 to 2010, when we did this research, one of the things that was obviously a hot topic was the economy and how places can either buffer themselves from completely being demolished from an economic perspective, or how could we hopefully start growing that back. So we wanted to make a connection to a so what. Now, the thing I want to mention to you all also is attachment, as we defined it, we're still writing the book on attachment. I can't express to you how much more there is to learn about this idea. Because even when we were just exploring it with hard outcomes like local GDP, we looked at other things. We looked at school dropout. We looked at population growth. We looked at, some students now are looking at public health seeking behaviors. So we don't even know the nugget of brilliance we might have in this idea of place attachment. We're just starting to understand. So there's lots of opportunities to still learn and build on this research and make it work in the real world. But ultimately, what we found was remarkably profound to me. And that was, of those 10 areas that we studied about the place that I just talked about, those drivers for attachment, 3 things mattered the most everywhere in driving those feelings of attachment. So of all those things we studied, in Detroit, to Miami, to Wichita, to Milledgeville, to Charlotte, to Philadelphia, to Long Beach, California, to Boulder, the same things mattered the most in driving those feelings of attachment. And they were perceptions of social offerings, perceptions of aesthetics, and perceptions of openness. People who felt good about those things in their community had higher levels of attachment. And people who felt bad about those things in the community had lower levels of attachment, above and beyond everything else. It was in a quartile of its own. Number 4, there was such a drop between the correlation between number 4 and these top 3. And we found, yes, in fact, that when you had higher levels of attachment, there was a correlation to higher levels of local economic growth. And I want you to hear me say economic growth. This isn't about rich places feeling better about being rich. It's about places that had an economic vitality to them that seemed to have some kind of connection to community attachment. Now, does that mean, of course, that the only thing that matters in driving local economic growth is attachment? Of course not. But you and I both know pretty well that place has not gotten a place at the economic development table for a long time. Place is not usually a factor. And when you talk about economic, to us it is, but to the rest of the world, you have to work that argument. What Soul of the Community allowed us to do was to make an empirical connection, for the first time really, and on a large national scale, between feelings of attachment and feeling bonded to place and a hard economic outcome. So I like to say place earned a place at the economic development table in that moment. Not that the other things didn't matter, but something we had not been paying attention to also mattered. So for 3 years, 26 cities, 43,000 people, the findings were the same every single year around social offerings, openness, and aesthetics. And the connection to the GDP growth connection continued to increase all 3 years of the study. And because there is such a tight correlation between these drivers and community attachment, it was remarkable because in the second and third years of the project, if a city was able to change perception of just one of those things, so just one, just an aspect of social offerings, just an aspect of aesthetics, they saw same-year differences in attachment. So civic engagement and social capital and all these other community ideas that are really important, attachment seems to be a little more nimble than some of those other ideas. Because when you would see these changes happen in people's minds, you would see their attachment grow that same year. And that within itself was quite remarkable. So a lot of people say, well, how is that possible? How could it be? Well, we might know. But a lot of people say, how could it be that attachment matters for local economic growth? That it's related, that it's part of the equation of economic growth. And so we were digging more into the data and trying to understand, can we find other benchmarks in between these two ideas, between attachment to local economic growth? And one of the things that we found was that people who are more attached to their places, to their cities, are also more productive at work. They're more satisfied in their jobs. They're more likely to spend more time in that community. They're more likely to invite others to come spend time with them in their community. That sense of pride comes out. They're more interested in being entrepreneurial. They have interest in making long-term financial investments, whether that be in a house or some other long-term plan that they have that will keep them there. So we started to sort of make those connections. I wouldn't say it's all tied up in a pretty box, but I think we're starting to see really what might be going on there. The other thing that was really powerful about this research, and I keep coming back to making this applied work and how critical it is to make this research applied. Besides the drivers for attachment, it's also unpacking this idea of attachment. So when every community that I would go into, I could be able to talk to that community about the percentage of residents who were attached, who were neutral, and who were not attached, and I could give demographic profiles of each of those categories. So communities could make informed choices about what they wanted to do and who they wanted to go after. So for example, in a lot of places, not every place, but a lot, almost all places, the young talent demographic was always in this not attached category because that's a little bit of the nature of the beast. Not everywhere, but in general, it can be very difficult to attach the young talent because it's always like, well, what's next? What are my opportunities in another place, perhaps? So we could talk about this is where those folks are. And then the neutral folks, which are the tipping point opportunity people. Who are they? Well, often they were the families, young families, who were okay, we're starting out. We kind of like it here. Do we want to try to tip those folks into being attached residents? And what would that look like for that particular demographic? And then, of course, do we just want to keep going where we're winning, which is with this attached category? Who are those folks? And it was an easier conversation than just saying, raise your attachment, and just, cookie cutter and figure it out. Just come up with something, when you could really start to break down the understanding. Of course, it was a little bit alarming, I will admit, that we had 40% of the folks we talk to feeling absolutely no attachment to where they live. It was depressing. And so seeing that consistently year over year was a hard thing to take. But a bright spot for us was also looking across the top. So where you see 3.56, 3.58, 3.57, so that's the average attachment level of the night communities. And those attachment scores didn't change very much, which to the night communication department was bad news. As a researcher, I was delighted, because what it said was that during this time between 2008 and 2010, when the bottom was falling out of places, economically speaking, if attachment was all about individual level economic outcomes, how well you're doing economically, then these numbers should have gone through the floor. And yet we saw places where attachment scores rose even as the economic fallout was devastating, which reinforced this idea that emotional attachment to place is about other things than you might expect. And I just want to spend a moment, because I know this is hard to read, but I want to show another example of how we used a tool to make this applied. So basically, this is our strengths opportunity map, where we would plot all the drivers for attachment along this grid, so that in every community that I would go into, I could do something that not a lot of communities get the chance to hear about, which is what they're getting right. You know, one of the biggest lessons, I think, for placemaking, and those of us in this field, is the importance of being strength-based in our approaches. Because what a strength category in our work says is that this is something about the community that matters for attachment, so it would be social offerings, openness, or aesthetics usually, and residents say you're doing pretty well on those things. And we have to know both of those sides of the equation. It's not good enough to just know what attaches people to place. You also need to know, as a place, how good are you doing on that, delivering that, bringing that to life. So when I would go into Gary, Indiana, or Detroit, Michigan, I could start the conversation with something that they never got to hear, which was, what, relatively, are they getting right? And that's a very powerful place to start dealing with what needs to be improved. So starting the conversation here and figuring out how you leverage that strength to get to what's not going well. And this created for places, yet again, a workable roadmap to understand, what do we do with this information? So this is the national map, so it's not as interesting as a local map, I would say. But you could say, okay, we seem to be doing really well in the perception of aesthetics. We're making progress with social offerings. We're struggling with openness. And that was a typical map for a lot of places. Not every place, but it was generally, that's sort of how it would work. So we would have conversations about, what is it about social offerings that people are responding well to? Specifically, what do you think is happening here? I'm a researcher, you're the expert. So help me understand, how is this working in the real world for you? And then saying, how can we leverage whatever it is you're getting right with social offerings to be a more welcoming place? And that is a more tangible, pragmatic approach to understanding what we need to do next. So I want to just go through briefly and talk about each of the drivers and a couple of nuggets that we found out about the importance of them in this idea of place attachment. Consistently, the number one thing everywhere, in every city, all 3 years, the number one thing that most was correlated to attachment were the opportunities for positive social interaction in the place. Everywhere. And so what we understood from the research and after talking to these folks and then doing some follow-up conversations on the ground is that social offerings to folks, this is how you know this isn't a placemaking research, because we didn't just focus on public spaces. We focused also in the informal spaces. We focused on what the business community, the private sector brings to the table as far as social offerings goes. We talked about things like people's backyards. So it was above and beyond a public spaces approach to looking at this, but what we found was quite remarkable in that it was so critical to us as humans to feel that social interaction need met by our place. And it didn't really matter, education or any of those demographics. It consistently was so critical to people feeling a level of attachment for their place. But of course, as these two pictures indicate, there are many ways to manifest social offerings in your community. So one is an example from LA Live in Los Angeles, and this is a community gathering of local musicians in Newfoundland. These are both social offerings that make sense for that place. So that's where we as placemakers have to be very careful in how we do our work, because it's not just social, oh, they did it there, let's do it here. It should work there, it worked there, it should work here. Not necessarily, without the context of place. When we lose our authenticity about how we create events and opportunities in places, they should reflect the narrative and identity of those places. But I said positive social interaction. Within the construct of social offerings is this idea that you cannot just build social infrastructure without caring about what happens in those spaces with each other. So you could have social offerings, opportunities in a place, but if people go into those settings and it doesn't go well, then it's just as bad as not even having the social offering to begin with. And the same is true for the opposite. So places that don't have a huge social infrastructure, but there's a huge level of civility and resident caring, and people perceive that, it replaces, to some extent, having that infrastructure. So this sign says, if you can't see it, says, please remember, these are kids, this is a game, the coaches volunteer, the umpires are human, and you don't play for the Cardinals. I'm pretty sure that that's not standard signage at Little League games, so something went on there that we need to be paying attention to. And so we needed to invest in that kind of sign. But increasingly, as I work with the corporate sector around this work, as they're trying to figure out talent recruitment and retention and where do we want to move our business and where do we want to develop our business corporation spots around the country, I hear increasingly from CEOs who talk about, we are trying to recruit people who are wanting us to sell places to them. Thanks for this great benefits package. This sounds like a great job. Tell me about this place. Where is it I got to live? And so they're increasingly going around and measuring places not only by the tax benefits they get by moving there, but also what is the quality of life going to be for the people? How hard of a sell is this place going to be? And one of the things they do, besides doing the usual stuff that they do, is that they're increasingly looking at the waterfronts. They're going to the Little League game. They're going, my favorite that I heard was, having representatives go into the community on the weekend. So you don't go on the mayor's tour. They go by themselves. And they'll sit at green lights to see how long it takes the car and back to start honking at them as an element of what kind of dynamic do we have here in this place? And how do we treat each other? Because they know that, especially for young talent, social offerings and feelings of openness and aesthetics are really important. So they're starting to measure places accordingly. And speaking of openness, so usually number 2 in driving feelings of attachment was how comfortable do residents feel in their own skin in a place. And not only how they feel, but how they perceive their neighbors to feel. So the idea behind openness is, does everybody feel like they have a place of belonging in this community? And so when we look at openness, it's really important to understand that we're not talking about tolerance. We're not talking about tolerance, because tolerance means I put up with you. Openness means please come. It's harder, and it's more difficult, and more communities struggle with this. But we asked about a whole gamut of experiences in the openness construct. It wasn't just about the historically disenfranchised groups that we all should be paying attention to, but we also asked, is this a good place for young talent? Is this a good place for families with young children? Is this a good place for seniors? Because the goal shouldn't be welcomeness to some, the goal should be welcomeness to all. And to create a place and a space where everybody feels like they can belong there. And so our openness construct was quite broad in trying to figure out the welcoming ideas. So when I choose these 2 pictures, I choose them on purpose, because though we most often can think about cultural diversity, and we can think about immigrant populations and how we can do a better job, at least I'll speak for my country, in being more welcoming to those groups. We can't do it at the expense of forgetting that there are other realities there. As in the second picture, there was a park in, I don't want to say the country, where they were going to outlaw seniors from coming to the playgrounds because they were worried about liability. I mean, I've been at a playground many a time and gotten hit with a swing, and nobody seemed to care about me, but they were very concerned about the liability aspects of having older people or seniors in the playgrounds with the children. That speaks to openness. Make no mistake about it. Because when you eliminate these opportunities for everybody to feel like they have a place there, it does send a message about whether or not you're wanted there. And that does seem to have an economic impact. So it might not be the first image that comes to mind when I say the word openness or welcoming, but it should be. Because it does seem to be not welcomeness to some, but welcomeness to all that we are trying to achieve. It is the goal that we are trying to make. And number 3, of course, is this idea of aesthetics. And aesthetics are one of those things where there's a huge range, sort of like social offerings. There's a huge range of how this manifests in a community. And how we measured aesthetics was really what was there when you got there, and what did you do with it when you got there. So it is this green space idea, but it's also this development idea. And it's also about the elimination of blight and decay. There are two sides of the coin of aesthetics, and both seem to matter. So you have to not only pay attention to the blight and decay because it contributes to how people feel about their place, but also understanding the importance of the positive side of aesthetics as well. So to some people, when they look at the picture on the left, they think, wow, vacation destination. And this other image of a path could feel like home. But where you see a vacation, somebody else sees home. And that's the orientation behind place and place narrative that we have to be paying attention to when we work on these drivers. And this particular finding was good news, I think, to a lot of people who worked in the public sector, who for a long time really thought aesthetics mattered but didn't really have a huge empirical justification that was a national in scope, 43,000 people that sort of confirmed that. And the thing is with the way local government works, I know in the States, is that when the economy got really tough, this was the first thing to go. This was the first thing that got the red ink. And of course, in competing priorities, when things are going badly, you have to make those choices. But my message had always been to leaders, I understand the competing priorities, but just recognize that when you make choices against this, there is an impact to your place that might show up eventually in your economic growth. So do what you can, but don't be so liberal with the red ink because you think it doesn't matter. So I just made your job harder because, in fact, it really does. So behind just doing social offerings, openness, and aesthetics, which when we started after the 3rd year and the findings were just the same, people were like, okay, we're just going to do social offerings, openness, and aesthetics. It became really critical to sort of ground that back into the places you're working in. You can't just look on somebody else's paper and copy their idea and put it down in your community because it loses a sense of authenticity. So one of the things that I've spent more recent time, after we got the findings communicated so broadly and related to, the next step was really sort of, first you need to do some homework about your place before you start these initiatives. And one of the things that's really critical for is to understand who you are as a place, your place identity, place narrative, whatever you want to call it, and knowing what's sacred in your place. Because when you have an idea of what it is about your place that people are responding to, it does something really important when you're doing placemaking. Number one is that it makes you focus on yourself. You're not always trying to keep up with the Joneses in a city kind of language. You're not always trying to be like somebody that you're not going to be. You have to learn how to feel comfortable and proud of who you are as a place. Now, can you optimize that? Can you be better at things that you get right? Absolutely. But understanding your place narrative and what's sacred about your place stops you from competing with other cities and instead focusing. So they built a zip line, we'll build a zip line kind of thinking to placemaking. The other thing that it does that I think is really powerful for places is that it prevents them from selling out. And I've worked in a lot of places where people are on the other side of that equation, and they have made choices about their place because they thought it would help them, when in fact what they did is they have a feeling that they've lost something of value. They lost their sense of place along the way. But if you're focused on your identity and who you are, you're less likely to make choices that go against who you are as a place. But yet the sources of what really drives that place identity come from a lot of different areas. So I've listed, a collection of them here. The people, the culture, the spirit, the history, the geography, the industry, the resources, the anchor institutions, the landmarks. These are the sources of where you can start to uncover what it is what is our competitive advantage, if you want. What are the things that we're getting right that we can focus on? And how does that relate to our place narrative? But in the States, one of the things that we saw pretty clearly is that sometimes cities and neighborhoods focus on just one of those things and think that's who they are. We are just our history. We are just our industry. We are just, this anchor institution that, the university, that's all we are. And the danger of unilateral narratives is if something happens to that industry in your community, there is a sense of loss of place, rather than putting eggs in more than one bucket and being proud of really there's more to you than just that. So we spend a lot of time now, I do anyway, talking about place narrative and understanding what it is that's sacred so we can make a covenant with ourselves to hold on to it as we continue down a path that we have to be on. So I'm often asked, so what? So what happened? What did all the cities do? What did places do with this information? And of course, that story's being written. I'm also very proud of the fact that the findings from Seoul are just as widely adopted in non-night communities as night communities. Even more so, I would say, to some extent, for a variety of different reasons. It really caught on in the States and in Canada, where I do a lot of work as well. But I'm going to focus on some things that came out from the night communities themselves. In Tallahassee, Florida, they were a night community, 3 years of the findings later. The transportation department came forward and said, we're going to be the champions of this work here, because we realize that we are critical to all of those things. We help connect people into the city or to the social hotspots in the place. That is part of what we do. The aesthetics of the place. We care about how wide the sidewalks are and how much the tree canopy shows up. How much do we have that there? That's part of what we should be caring about. Openness. If a young college student can't make it to class on our transportation system, that sends a message to them about whether or not we want them here. If our elderly population cannot get their needs met with medical appointments or where they'd like to go, that sends a message of welcomeness. So they really came forward as what, at the time, and this happened early on in the process, when you talk about the unusual suspects coming forward and saying, we get it, we're going to move forward with this. In Myrtle Beach, it was a bit of a different story. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, is a tourism destination for a lot of folks. And Myrtle Beach was really suffering, I think, from a loss of place, where they felt like, we wish we had heard this 10 years ago, because we've actually made some choices where we turned our place over and made development choices based on the tourism population that has, in effect, disattached us from our own place. And so they've abdicated the beach to the tourists because, oh, God, we can't go down there. And so then they were like, well, if we don't have the beach, what do we have? Because, who are we, kind of thing. And it really spawned this conversation about them trying to rediscover their place. So it was about making different development choices, but also rediscovering that they were more than the beach. And how to really get back to that. And increasingly, I find that tourism industries are paying attention to this stuff. And I always say, your number one customer for tourism is your resident. If your resident doesn't buy the tourism package, you've already stepped off the cliff somewhere. And that's part of what we have to be doing when we talk about the far-reaching effects of place and placemaking. You know, tourism and its impact on communities is really there. In Miami, they took a slightly different approach, because if you understand that Soul of the Community talks about perceptions, then you also have to understand the reality of the place. So what Miami attempted to do was to find the social indicators that we talked about, the public perception indicators, and find administrative crossovers. So how do we measure aesthetics from an administrative level? How do we measure social offerings? And does resident perception meet the reality of what's happening here? Because sometimes in places it's not about building something else, it's about changing perceptions of what's already there. In Charlotte, we took the research to a neighborhood level, which was really fascinating, to an impoverished neighborhood, 2 zip codes, and found out not only did they have higher attachment levels than the rest of Charlotte, but also that the drivers stayed the same. Because one of the criticisms of Seoul is that when you're at an MSA level, you lose some of that neighborhood variability. And Fort Wayne's changed its leadership to adopt this principle. And lastly, St. Paul, which is going to cue me into the video that I'm going to leave you with today. St. Paul took on a placemaking residency, which was the second year this year. I spent a week there doing a lot of different engagements and workshops with folks. But one of the things that we did were neighborhood walks. And they didn't tell me anything about these neighborhoods. We just went in them together. And I walked around with the residents, and we had a placemaking conversation. And at the end of the walk, $500 was given so that the residents could come up with one idea to start doing something immediately. So with that, I'm going to end you with this video that's sort of 3 minutes that sort of tells you a little bit about that experience.
Today we're taking a walking tour of the neighborhood at the Western Station area, and now we're in Frogtown.
Right now we have this walkability survey that we're attempting to do to try to get improvements for the station areas and the areas around.
We, as a community, want to make this area better using place-making principles, and basically that means that we want to make sure there's all the amenities that we need in this neighborhood to lift up our neighborhood. So that's economic development, that's social amenities, that's green space, public art, all of those things that make any particular part of your neighborhood a great place to be.
This is the most diverse neighborhood in all of St. Paul.
But we really try to look at all of the assets here.
Placemaking, when we do it correctly, should be about first identifying and honoring the assets of the places that we have.
Part of this tour of the neighborhood is a workshop at My Village Restaurant. Katherine is an expert in placemaking.
Because all of these things contribute to the pride that a resident has when they look around and can feel proud of their space. Some of these neighborhoods and their attempts to really create aesthetics and beauty and garden spaces, even on the smallest scale, can make such a big difference in the pride and the dignity that people have about their place, and that really does matter.
We're taking a walk around the neighborhood to look at all the assets that we have here and how we can build on those assets to make our neighborhood better.
There's no such thing as too small a scale when it comes to placemaking, and I think every single attempt, the birdhouse on the tree, the recognition of the importance of the nests, to the bulbs that are planted and the planters, because anybody can see something wrong. Sometimes it takes courage to see what's right. Let's look at this house, the colorful nest down just at the bottom, pink house, the American flag, the bird bath. It all matters, and I don't know if we've paid as much attention to that the little things do matter. But if you start with what's going right, it provides a very important point to when to start leveraging what's going right to deal with what's going wrong.
When we talk about assets in our neighborhood, how we could build on our asset and look at how other communities have created place in their neighborhoods.
Places like this and places that have histories like this one does often are perceived as being the problems in the larger city. And yet what we find here, if we look a little bit deeper past the way we usually assess places, is that there's something very powerful and a resource here that we should be taking more advantage of. When residents have pride of place that they're willing to do the little things, even if they don't have a lot of expendable money, but they're willing to spend what they have in making a place that they can feel proud of, you know that you have an asset there in a resident that's to be mobilized. And I really feel like consistently, the more that we can highlight those features of places, it also helps us to become more strength-based in our work.
This is a vibrant neighborhood that we have a lot to offer. Folks need to come down and see.
So that's a little glimpse of what we've been doing lately with Soul. I thank you for your attention today.